What would you do if your twin brother asked you to do something all day and night? Something so personal it made you question everything about yourself, your identity, your boundaries, even the very nature of love? Sounds intense, right? But that's exactly what happened in this story. And trust me, by the time we're done, you'll see love through a lens you've probably never considered before. Twins are fascinating, aren't they? They share an unbreakable bond that most of us can only dream of having with someone else. From finishing each other's sentences to knowing exactly how the other feels without saying a word, their connection is almost supernatural. But what happens when that bond crosses into territory no one talks about? When the line between sibling love and romantic love starts to blur. That's where this story gets complicated and incredibly human. Today, we're diving deep into a tale of two brothers who were inseparable from birth, but found themselves navigating emotions neither of them expected. It's a story about love, yes, but also about identity, courage, and the lengths we go to for the people who mean the most to us. By the end of this video, you'll understand not just their journey, but also some universal truths about relationships, connection, and the power of acceptance. So why should you stick around until the end? Because this isn't just another story. It's raw, it's real, and it might challenge everything you thought you knew about love. You'll learn how societal expectations can shape our choices, how fear can hold us back, and ultimately, how love has a way of finding its own path, even in the most unexpected places. Oh, and there's a twist you won't see coming. I promise. But how do we get here? How does a bond as pure as twinship evolve into something so complex? Let me take you back to the beginning, to a childhood filled with laughter, secrets, and dreams shared under the same roof. Stick with me, because every moment builds up to something unforgettable. Before we move forward, thank you for being here. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join our growing community of curious minds and open hearts. This channel is all about exploring life's untold stories, the ones that make us think, feel, and sometimes even question our own beliefs. So welcome, whether you're new or returning, and let's embark on this journey together. Growing up as identical twins was like living in a world made just for two. From the moment we were born, people couldn't tell us apart, not even our parents at first. It wasn't just about looking alike, it was deeper than that. We shared everything: clothes, toys, secrets, and dreams. Some days, it felt like we didn't need words to communicate. One look, one gesture, and we knew exactly what the other was thinking. People used to joke that we weren't just brothers. We were two halves of the same soul. And honestly, they weren't wrong. Our childhood was filled with moments that only we understood. Like the time we dressed identically on picture day, but swapped outfits halfway through school just to confuse everyone, including our teachers. Or when we came up with secret hand signals to warn each other if mom was about to walk into the room while we were doing something we shouldn't. We pranked teachers together too, like the time we convinced our math teacher that National No Homework Day was a real thing. For weeks afterward, she double-checked every random holiday we mentioned. Those little victories felt bigger than anything because we did them together. We finished each other's sentences without even trying. If I started telling a story and forgot the punchline, he'd jump right in like he'd been waiting for his cue all along. It wasn't annoying, it was comforting. Knowing someone had your back, no matter what, gave us this unshakable confidence. We were unstoppable, or so we thought. But looking back now, I realize it wasn't always perfect. There were tiny cracks beneath the surface that neither of us wanted to acknowledge. Sometimes, I felt overshadowed by him. He was more outgoing, funnier, quicker to make friends. Teachers loved him, classmates admired him, and everyone seemed drawn to his energy. Don't get me wrong, I adored him, but there were moments when I wondered if anyone noticed me outside of being his twin. And maybe he felt it too, though he never said it out loud. Occasionally, I'd catch him staring off into space, lost in thoughts I didn't understand. At the time, I shrugged it off. Twins are supposed to be inseparable, right? So why would either of us ever feel alone? Back then, those feelings seemed small, almost insignificant. But now I know they were seeds planted long before we realized how much they'd grow. Looking back on those early years, it's hard not to feel nostalgic. Everything seemed simpler when we were kids. The world hadn't yet intruded on our bubble, and love, whether for family or something else entirely, was uncomplicated. We truly believed nothing could ever come between us. Life felt infinite, limitless, like the bond we shared would last forever, until life proved us wrong. Because as close as we were, even the strongest connections can shift in ways you don't expect, especially when the lines between brotherhood and something deeper start to blur. Adolescence hit us like a storm we weren't prepared for. One day, we were kids playing pranks and finishing each other's sentences. The next, everything felt different. It wasn't just the physical changes, though those were hard enough to deal with. Acne, cracking voices, awkward growth spurts. It was like our bodies had turned against us overnight. But the real shift happened inside. Emotions we'd never felt before started bubbling up, messy and confusing, and they didn't come with instructions. Hormones were relentless, making everything feel more intense. Friendships changed. Crushes became all-consuming. Peer pressure loomed over every decision. Suddenly, fitting in mattered more than it ever had. And while most people could distance themselves from their siblings during this time, to find their own identities, their own space, we couldn't. We were still tethered together, closer than anyone else, but now navigating uncharted territory that neither of us fully understood. For me, the confusion ran deeper than just figuring out who I was or who I wanted to be. I started questioning my feelings, not just toward others, but toward him. My brother. At first, I tried to brush it off. It's just because we're twins, I told myself. We've always been close. This is normal. But deep down, I knew something was different. I couldn't stop thinking about him. Not in the way I used to, not as just my brother. He was on my mind constantly, in ways I didn't know how to explain. There were moments when I caught myself staring at him too long, noticing things I hadn't before. The way his smile lit up a room, the sound of his laugh, the way he tilted his head when he was deep in thought. These weren't new traits, but suddenly they meant something more. Something I didn't want to admit, even to myself. And then there were the stolen glances. The ones I hoped he wouldn't notice, but secretly wished he would. Sometimes I'd catch him looking back, and for a split second, it felt like he might understand what I was feeling. But just as quickly, he'd look away, leaving me wondering if I'd imagined it altogether. Those fleeting moments left me breathless and terrified that I didn't know what was happening inside me, but I couldn't ignore it either. Every interaction between us felt heavier, loaded with unspoken emotions I couldn't put into words. Conversations that used to flow effortlessly turned stilted, filled with awkward silences that stretched longer than they should have. We still shared secrets, but something had shifted. A distance grew between us, not physical, but emotional. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but undeniable once I let myself see it. He noticed too. How could he not? He wasn't blind. There were times when he'd call me out on it, asking why I seemed distracted, why I wasn't acting like myself. His tone wasn't accusatory, but it still made my stomach twist. What could I say? That I didn't trust myself around him anymore? That being near him sent my heart racing for reasons I couldn't explain. Sometimes I wondered if he felt it too. If maybe, just maybe, he was struggling with the same thoughts I was. Other times, I convinced myself I was imagining things, that he was as confused by me as I was by myself. Either way, it hurt. Our once effortful connection became strained, weighed down by emotions neither of us knew how to address, or even name. Things came to a head one afternoon after school. We were sitting in our room, side by side like we always did, but the silence between us was suffocating. Finally, he broke it. "You've been acting weird lately," he said, his voice soft but probing. "Is everything okay?" I froze. How do you answer a question like that when you don't even know where to begin? So I shrugged, muttered something vague about stress, and changed the subject. But later, lying in bed that night, I replayed the conversation over and over in my head. What if he knew? What if he suspected? Or worse, what if he didn't feel the same way and hated me for even thinking about him like this? That's when things took a turn neither of us expected. Because adolescence wasn't done with us yet. It kept pushing, pulling, forcing us to confront truths we weren't ready to face. And as much as I wanted to go back to the simplicity of childhood, to the days when love meant friendship and nothing more, I knew we couldn't. Whatever was growing between us, whatever these feelings were, they weren't going away anytime soon. They were changing everything. It happened on a night that felt like any other, but in hindsight, it was the moment everything changed. We've been hanging out in our room, just the two of us like we always did. The house was quiet. Mom and Dad had gone to bed hours ago, and the only sounds were the hum of the fan and the occasional creak of the floorboards as one of us shifted positions. We weren't talking much. Instead, we were lost in our own worlds, scrolling through our phones or staring at the ceiling. But something about the silence felt heavier than usual, like the air itself was holding its breath, that I don't know what made me say it. Maybe it was the weight of all the unspoken words between us, pressing down until I couldn't keep them locked inside anymore. Or maybe it was the way he looked at me earlier that evening. Not with confusion this time, but with something softer, almost tender. Whatever it was, I knew I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Not when my heart felt like it was going to burst if I didn't let him know the truth. "I need to tell you something," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. He glanced up from his phone, eyebrows raised in curiosity. "What's up?" he asked, his tone light, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. For a second, I hesitated. My throat tightened, and my hands trembled slightly where they rested on my knees. This was it, the point of no return. Once I said it, there was no taking it back. But I also knew I couldn't live another day carrying this secret alone. So I took a deep breath, looked him straight in the eyes, and said it. "I think I'm falling for you." The room went completely still. Even the faint hum of the fan seemed to fade into nothingness. For what felt like an eternity, he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. His lips parted as if he wanted to respond, but no words came out. I could see the shock rippling across his face, followed by confusion, and then something else I couldn't quite place. Was it fear, guilt, or attraction? My stomach churned as I waited for him to say something. Anything. But he stayed silent, and the longer the silence stretched, the more panicked I became. "Say something," I pleaded, my voice cracking under the weight of vulnerability. "Please." Finally, he spoke, though his words were hesitant, unsure. "What do you mean, falling for me?" His voice was soft, almost fragile, like he was afraid of hearing the answer. "What do you think I mean?" I shot back, frustration bubbling up despite my best efforts to stay calm. "I mean, I can't stop thinking about you. About us. It's not just brotherly love anymore. It's more." He flinched at the word "more," and I immediately regretted saying it. Had I pushed too far? Said too much? But before I could backtrack, he stood up abruptly and started pacing the room. His movements were restless, agitated, like he didn't know what to do with himself or with what I'd just told him. "This isn't normal," he muttered under his breath, running a hand through his hair. "We're brothers. Twins. You're not supposed to feel like this about me. Do you think I don't know that?" I snapped, anger masking the ache in my chest. "You think I chose this? Do you have any idea how hard it's been to carry this around? To look at you every day and pretend I don't feel whatever this is." He stopped pacing and turned to face me, his eyes searching mine like he was trying to find some kind of explanation in them. "But why now? Why does this have to happen now?" "Because I can't ignore it anymore," I shouted, my voice breaking. "Because I can't keep lying to myself or to you. Because I'm scared, okay? I'm so fucking scared of what this means, for us, for everyone. But I'm even more scared of losing you because I didn't tell you the truth." The room fell silent again, except for the sound of our heavy breathing. I could see the conflict playing out on his face, fear warring with curiosity, guilt wrestling with something that looked dangerously close to hope. And then, slowly, he sank back onto the bed beside me, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "I don't know what to do," he admitted quietly, his voice trembling. This changes everything. What are we supposed to do now?" Neither of us knew the answer to that. We sat there in stunned silence, the weight of my confession hanging over us like a storm cloud threatening to break. All the questions we'd avoided for so long came rushing to the surface. What did this mean for our relationship? For our family? For who we were as individuals? Could we ever go back to the way things used to be? Or did we even want to? Ignoring it wasn't an option anymore. The days that followed my confession were a blur of confusion, fear, and something else I couldn't quite name. Something dangerously close to hope. Neither of us knew what to do next, but one thing was clear. We couldn't go back to the way things were before. The truth had been spoken, and now it lingered between us like an uninvited guest who refused to leave. Every word, every glance, every moment together felt charged with meaning. As if the air itself had shifted. First, we tried to act normal, or at least as normal as two people could when they'd just admitted feelings that defied every rule society had ever taught them. During the day, we pretended nothing had changed. We joked around with friends, helped mom carry groceries, and teased each other about dumb stuff like always eating the last slice of pizza. To everyone else, we were still just twins, inseparable and carefree. But behind closed doors, everything was different. It started small, little moments that made my heart race and my palms sweat. Like the time he brushed past me in the hallway, his hand lingering against mine for just a second longer than necessary. Or the way he'd sit closer to me on the couch when no one was looking, his knee brushing against mine like it was an accident, but wasn't. At night, when the house was quiet and everyone else was asleep, we'd find ourselves gravitating toward each other, drawn by some invisible force neither of us fully understood. One evening, after weeks of tiptoeing around our new reality, something happened that neither of us expected. We were sitting on the floor of my room, backs against the bed, talking softly about nothing in particular. Well, he was talking. I was too busy trying not to stare at the curve of his jawline or the way his hair fell across his forehead. Then, out of nowhere, he reached over and took my hand. His fingers slid between mine hesitantly at first, like he wasn't sure how I'd react. When I didn't pull away, his grip tightened ever so slightly, and we both froze, holding our breaths. That single touch sent a jolt through me, electric and terrifying all at once. It felt right, and yet so incredibly wrong. My mind screamed at me to let go, to remind myself who he was and what this meant, but my body refused to obey. Instead, I squeezed his hand back, silently telling him I wasn't ready to let go either. For a few stolen seconds, the world outside disappeared. There was no judgment, no rules, no consequences, just us existing in a bubble where none of those things mattered. But the bubble always burst eventually. As soon as we heard footsteps in the hallway, we yanked our hands apart, hearts pounding like guilty teenagers caught sneaking out after curfew. That's how it was for us. Moments of connection followed by panic, secrecy, and guilt. Each stolen kiss, each fleeting touch, came with a price, one we weren't sure we could afford to pay. Doubts crept in constantly, gnawing at the edges of whatever fragile happiness we managed to find. One night, after another secret rendezvous in my room, he turned to me with tears shining in his eyes. "Is this even okay?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "What are we doing? This isn't normal." "Who cares what's normal?" I shot back, though my own confidence wavered under his scrutiny. "Why should we have to live by someone else's rules? Don't you think we deserve to be happy?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at the wall, his jaw clenched like he was fighting an internal battle I couldn't see. Finally, he sighed and said, "I don't know. Maybe you're right. But what happens when people find out? What happens when mom and dad figure it out? Or our friends? They'll hate us. Everyone will." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, because deep down, I knew he was right. Society had drilled it into us from birth. Love is supposed to follow certain guidelines, stay within certain boundaries. And here we were, breaking every single one of them. The thought of facing judgment from family, friends, strangers was paralyzing. What would they say? How would they look at us? Would they understand? Or would they turn their backs on us forever? Still, there were moments when I convinced myself it didn't matter, that we deserved happiness, no matter how unconventional it might seem to others. Those moments usually came late at night when the house was quiet and it was just the two of us. Like the time he leaned in and kissed me for the first time, a soft, tentative press of lips that left me dizzy and breathless. Or the mornings when we woke up tangled in each other's arms, sunlight streaming through the curtains, and for a brief moment, it felt like nothing else existed. But reality always came crashing back sooner or later. Friends started asking questions we didn't want to answer. Why were we spending so much time alone together lately? Why do we seem distant, distracted? Even Mom noticed something was off. "You boys okay?" she asked one afternoon, her brow furrowed in concern. "You've been acting strange." "We're fine," we both replied in unison, exchanging a quick glance before looking away. She didn't push it, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. Neither was anyone else. The pressure mounted with each passing day, squeezing the life out of the fragile bubble we'd built around ourselves. Every touch, every glance, it felt electric, but also came with consequences neither of us were ready for. Because as much as we wanted to believe we could shut out the world and focus only on each other, the truth was unavoidable. The world wasn't going to disappear. Sooner or later, we'd have to face it and decide whether we were strong enough to stand together or if the weight of everything pulling us apart would be too much to bear. The tension between us had been building for weeks, a pressure cooker of emotions that neither of us knew how to release. We were walking on eggshells, tiptoeing around our feelings and the world outside, trying desperately to keep our secrets safe. But secrets have a way of unraveling when you least expect it, and ours exploded in the most devastating way possible. It started with an argument. A stupid, petty fight over something trivial, whether we should order pizza or Chinese for dinner. Normally, we would have laughed it off, called each other ridiculous names, and ended up ordering both just to spite each other. But this time was different. The stress of hiding who we were, the constant fear of being discovered, the weight of everything unsaid, it all boiled over until the smallest disagreement became a battleground. "You never think about anyone but yourself," he snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut through me. "Do you even care what this is doing to me? To us?" I froze, stunned by the venom in his tone. This wasn't about food. It hadn't been for days. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice rising to match his. "You're the one acting like this is some kind of phase we can just ignore. Like pretending everything's fine will make it go away. And what's your solution, huh?" He shot back, standing now, pacing the room like a caged animal. "Run away together? Tell Mom and Dad the truth? Let everyone know their perfect little twins aren't so perfect after all." His words hit like a punch to the gut. Not because they were wrong, but because they were terrifyingly close to the truth. I didn't have answers, just a desperate need to hold on to him, no matter what. "I don't know what the solution is," I admitted, my voice breaking. "But shutting me out isn't helping. Pushing me away isn't going to fix anything." He stopped pacing and looked at me, his eyes filled with pain and frustration. For a moment, I thought he might soften, might come sit beside me and let me hold him like we used to. Instead, he grabbed his jacket from the chair and headed for the door. "Maybe there isn't a solution," he said quietly, his voice hollow. "Maybe this was always doomed from the start." And then he was gone. The house felt eerily silent without him. I sat there for hours, staring at the spot where he'd stood, replaying the fight over and over in my head. What could I have said differently? How could I have made him stay? The questions swirled endlessly, leaving me more lost than ever. When he didn't come home that night, or the next morning, I convinced myself he just needed space, that he'd cool off and come back, and we'd figure things out together like we always did. But as the days turned into a week, reality began to sink in. He wasn't coming back. Not yet, anyway. And the longer he stayed away, the more the silence consumed me. Losing him felt like losing a part of myself. For the first time in my life, I realized what it meant to truly miss someone, not just as a brother, but as someone who held my heart in ways I couldn't explain. Every corner of the house reminded me of him. The dent in the wall from the time we wrestled too hard, the playlist on my phone full of songs we used to sing along to, the empty space beside me in bed where he used to sleep. Even mundane things, like pouring cereal or brushing my teeth, felt achingly incomplete without him there. I tried to distract myself. I threw myself into schoolwork, binge-watched shows I barely paid attention to, hung out with friends who didn't understand why I seemed so distant. Nothing worked. No matter how busy I kept myself, the ache in my chest remained, gnawing at me day and night. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, heard his voice, felt the ghost of his touch against my skin. Meanwhile, whispers started spreading among our friends and family. Where is he? Why hadn't anyone seen him lately? At first, I brushed off the questions, making vague excuses about him needing a break or spending time with other people. But eventually, Mom confronted me directly. Is everything okay between you two? She asked one evening, her voice gentle but probing. You seem different. We're fine. I lied, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. Just dealing with some stuff, you know. She nodded, though I could tell she wasn't convinced. Still, she didn't push it, which only made me feel worse. Here I was, lying to the woman who raised us, hiding the fact that her sons were falling apart in ways she couldn't even imagine. As the weeks dragged on, I spiraled further into depression. Food lost its taste, laughter felt foreign, and the world outside seemed impossibly gray. I hated myself for letting things get this far, for pushing him away, for not fighting harder to keep us together. I hated the secrecy, the shame, the endless cycle of guilt and longing that followed me everywhere I went. Most of all, I hated the emptiness left behind his absence. It was suffocating, but just when I thought it was over, when I convinced myself I'd never see him again. Fate had other plans. One rainy afternoon, as I trudged home from school with my hoodie pulled low over my head, I spotted him across the street. He was standing under the awning of a coffee shop, looking older somehow, wearier. My heart leapt into my throat, and for a second, I thought I was imagining him. But no, he was real, alive, right there. Our eyes met and time seemed to stop. Neither of us moved, neither of us spoke. The rain poured down around us, soaking my clothes and plastering my hair to my forehead, but I didn't care. All I could focus on was him, the person I'd spent every waking moment missing, hating myself for driving away. Finally, he took a step forward, then another, until he was standing right in front of me. His expression was unreadable, torn between anger, sadness, and something else I couldn't quite place. Hey, he said softly, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. Hey, I replied, my own voice shaking. Where have you been? He hesitated, glancing down at his shoes before meeting my gaze again. Figuring things out, he said simply, trying to decide if running away from you was worth it. And I asked, holding my breath. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached out and took my hand, his fingers trembling slightly as they intertwined with mine. I missed you, he admitted, his voice cracking. More than I thought was possible. Tears welled up in my eyes, blurring my vision as I squeezed his hand back. I missed you too, I whispered. So much. We stood there for what felt like forever, the rain soaking us to the bone, neither of us willing to let go. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the secrets, the judgment, the fear. Just him. Just us. And for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we still had a chance that IT wasn't supposed to happen like this. A reunion born out of chaos, desperation, and the kind of raw vulnerability that strips you down to your core. But life has a way of forcing moments upon you when you least expect them. And for us, it came in the form of a family emergency. Mom had fallen ill, nothing life-threatening, but serious enough to send shockwave through her household. When I got the call, my first instinct was to rush home, no questions asked. Family is family, after all. But as I packed my bag and headed for the door, another thought crept in. What if he's there? What if this is the moment we've been avoiding, for better or worse? The drive felt endless, every mile stretching longer than the last. My mind raced with possibilities, replaying every argument, every stolen glance, every touch that had once meant everything and now felt painfully distant. By the time I pulled into the driveway, my hand was shaking so badly I could barely turn off the car. When I walked into the house, the air was thick with tension. Mom lay on the couch, pale but conscious, while Dad hovered nearby, his usual calm demeanor replaced by worry lines etched deep into his face. And then I saw him, standing in the corner of the living room, arms crossed tightly over his chest, his eyes fixed on the floor. For a split second, our gazes locked, and the world seemed to stop spinning. No one said anything about us being in the same room together. Not mom, not dad, not even the neighbor who'd stopped by to check on things. Everyone was too focused on making sure mom was okay. Still, the energy between us was undeniable, crackling like static electricity in the charged silence. We didn't speak, not at first. Instead, we moved around each other cautiously, helping where we could, fetching water, adjusting blankets, doing anything to avoid acknowledging the elephant in the room. But eventually, the weight of everything unsaid became unbearable. After hours of sitting vigil beside mom, I stepped outside for some fresh air, needing a moment to breathe. He followed me without saying a word, closing the door softly behind him as we stood side by side on the porch. The night was cool, the stars hidden behind a blanket of clouds, and for a while, neither of us spoke. "I'm sorry," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "For leaving, for shutting you out, for everything." His words caught me off guard, and I turned to look at him, really look at him for the first time in weeks. His face was tired, shadowed with guilt and regret, but also something softer, something that told me he still cared, maybe more than either of us realized. "You don't have to apologize," I replied, though my voice trembled slightly. "I'm the one who pushed you away. I should have handled things differently." "No," he interrupted, shaking his head firmly. "This isn't just on you. It's on both of us. We let fear dictate everything. Our choices, our relationship, our happiness. And yeah, maybe what we're feeling doesn't fit into anyone else's rules or expectations. But love doesn't care about rules or labels. It just wants to exist. Don't you think we deserve that?" His words hit me like a punch to the heart, knocking loose all the walls I'd built around myself since he left. Tears welled up in my eyes, hot and unrelenting, and before I could stop myself, I reached out and grabbed his hand. He didn't pull away. Instead, he squeezed back, his grip firm and steady despite the storm raging inside us both. "We can't keep running from this," I admitted, my voice breaking under the weight of everything I'd been holding in. "From each other. No matter how hard it gets, no matter what people say or think, we owe it to ourselves to try, to fight for us." He nodded slowly, his own tears spilling over as he pulled me into a tight embrace. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt whole again. Like the missing piece of me had finally found its way home. By the time we went back inside, something had shifted, not just between us, but in the way we approached everything. We stayed by mom's side throughout the night, taking turns checking her temperature, making sure she was comfortable, sharing quiet smiles whenever our eyes met. There was still so much uncertainty ahead of us, the judgment we might face, the risks we have to take. But for the first time, we faced it together. In the days that followed, we talked, really talked, about everything we'd been too afraid to confront before. About our fears, our doubts, our hopes for the future. We admitted our mistakes, vowed to be better, and promised never to shut each other out again. It wasn't easy. There were moments of hesitation, flashes of insecurity, but we kept reminding ourselves why we were fighting in the first place. Because love doesn't come with guarantees. It doesn't promise smooth sailing or an absence of pain. What it does promise is connection, meaning, a chance to build something real, even if it means breaking every rule society has ever taught you to follow. And for us, that was enough. This time, I told him one evening as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, we decided not to run away from our feelings. We chose us. He smiled, leaning his head against mine, and for the first time in a long time, I believed we'd made the right choice. Looking back on everything we've been through, the fights, the secrets, the heartbreak, it's hard not to feel overwhelmed by how far we've come. This journey wasn't just about love. It was about discovering who we are, both individually and together. It forced us to confront parts of ourselves we'd rather have ignored. Our fears, our insecurities, the societal expectations that had shaped us for so long. But in doing so, it also taught us something invaluable. That love is messy, complicated, and often painful, But it's also one of the most human experiences we'll ever know. One of the biggest lessons we learned is that love isn't always easy. In fact, sometimes it feels downright impossible. There were moments when giving up seemed like the only option, when the weight of judgment and fear felt too heavy to carry. But what we realized is this: true love doesn't ask you to have all the answers. It doesn't demand perfection or insist you follow a set of rules. What it does do is push you to grow, to become braver, kinder, more honest versions of yourself. And if you're lucky, it gives you someone who grows right alongside you. That we also learned that identity isn't fixed. For years, we thought being twins meant fitting into a certain mold, finishing each other's sentences, sharing everything, never straying too far from the bond we were born with. But as we grew older, and especially as we navigated these uncharted feelings, we came to understand that identity is fluid. It evolves, shifts, challenges you. Loving each other didn't mean losing ourselves. It meant finding new layers of who we are and learning to embrace them, even when they scared us. Perhaps the most important thing we discovered is that true connections transcend boundaries. Society will tell you there are lines you shouldn't cross, boxes you need to check, roles you must play. But real love doesn't care about any of that. It exists beyond labels, beyond logic, beyond what others think you should be. It finds a way, even in the darkest corners, because at its core, love is about connection, pure and simple. Two people choosing each other again and again, no matter the cost. Anyone watching this, I want you to take something away from our story. If you've ever doubted your feelings, if you've ever questioned whether you deserve happiness, whether your love is normal enough, whether you're brave enough to face the world, remember this: you're not alone. So many of us walk around carrying these same doubts, these same fears. But here's the truth: love doesn't wait for permission. It doesn't ask for approval. It shows up in unexpected ways, in unexpected people, and it asks only one thing of you: that you let it exist. If you're lucky enough to find someone who sees you, really sees you, for everything you are and everything you could be, don't let fear stand in your way. Fight for them. Fight for yourself. Because while the road might be hard, the reward, a love that's real, deep, and unwavering, is worth every step. Whatever your journey looks like, whoever you choose to share it with, never forget: love finds a way, even in the darkest corners. And sometimes, all it takes is saying yes to yourself, to the person standing beside you, to the possibility of something beautiful.